Lightning split the stormy Albany sky as Officer James Miller spotted a sleek black Mercedes running not just one but three red lights. In quick succession, the rookie cop's adrenaline surged as he flipped his lights on and gunned the engine, pursuing the vehicle that seemed to be deliberately taunting him through the rain-slicked streets of downtown. The 23-year-old officer had graduated from the academy just 3 months ago and was eager to prove himself, especially since his father had been a legendary detective in the same precinct. The black Mercedes showed no signs of slowing down as it weaved through the light traffic. Evening, his dispatch radio crackled to life, asking for his location, but Miller was too focused on the chase to respond. The pursuit continued past the state capitol, gilding its magnificent architecture, looming in the darkness like a watchful guardian. Miller noticed the driver appeared to be alone and handled the vehicle with exceptional skill, taking corners with precision that suggested professional training. The rain intensified, creating sheets of water that his patrol car struggled to navigate through, yet the mystery driver seemed unaffected by the treacherous conditions ahead. Miller could see the district courthouse, where he had dreamed of making his first major arrest since joining the force. The black Mercedes signal light suddenly blinked, indicating a turn into Warren Street, a quiet area known for its row of historic brownstones. Miller followed, maintaining a safe distance, his training kicking in as he radioed dispatch with his location and situation code. The vehicle's taillights illuminated the rain, creating an eerie red glow in the darkness. Miller noticed something odd about the car's plates. They seemed to be government issue, but the rain made them difficult to read clearly. Checking his watch, Miller noted it was 11:47 p.m., well past the end of his shift, but he was about to let this one go. The driver had committed multiple infractions, and their behavior suggested they might be involved in something more serious than just traffic violations. His gut instinct, developed from countless ride-alongs with his father, told him this would be a defining moment in his career. The Mercedes finally slowed, its brake lights casting crimson reflections in the puddles that had formed along the cobblestone street. Miller positioned his patrol car strategically to prevent any sudden escape attempts. His hand rested instinctively on his weapon as department protocol dictated for high-risk stops. The entire scene was illuminated by his vehicle's flashing lights, creating a disorienting strobe effect in the rainfall. Miller took a deep breath, remembering his training about approaching suspicious vehicles. He grabbed his flashlight and checked his body cam was active as he stepped out into the rain, his boots splashing in puddles that had formed on the uneven pavement. The air was thick with tension and the smell of wet asphalt, while distant thunder rolled across the sky, adding an ominous backdrop to the unfolding scene. Little did Officer Miller know that his next few steps toward the Mercedes would set in motion a chain of events that would reshape his entire career and change the Albany Police Department's approach to traffic stops forever. The mysterious driver finally pulled into a dimly lit side street, their tinted windows rolling down just enough to let out a cloud of frustration. Officer Miller approached, weapon ready, as the woman inside spoke in a commanding tone that she was above his jurisdiction. His ego bruised and authority challenged, he reached for his handcuffs. The interior of the Mercedes revealed glimpses of luxury leather seats and what appeared to be important documents scattered across the passenger seat. Miller could make out official government seals on some of the papers, but the woman quickly gathered them, blocking them from his view. Her perfectly manicured hands gripped the steering wheel as she refused to make eye contact with him, instead staring straight ahead with an air of superiority that made Miller increasingly uncomfortable. The rain continued to pour, creating a curtain of water around the vehicle, while occasional flashes of lightning illuminated the woman's stern profile. She appeared to be in her mid-40s, wearing what Miller could tell was an expensive suit that probably cost more than his monthly salary. Miller requested her license and registration for the third time, his patience wearing thin as she continued to dismiss his authority with vague references to classified business and government clearance levels that she claimed he didn't have access to. Her phone kept buzzing with incoming messages, which she glanced at periodically, adding to Miller's growing irritation. The situation was quickly escalating beyond a simple traffic stop. Reaching into the glove compartment, the woman pulled out what looked like an official badge, but before she could open it, Miller had already made his decision. Years of watching his father deal with entitled officials who thought they got above the law had left their mark. He wasn't about to let another one slip through, especially after such a blatant display of disrespect for law enforcement. Thunder crashed overhead as Miller ordered her to step out of the vehicle, his hand steady on his weapon, as department protocol dictated for non-compliant subjects. The woman let out a short laugh that echoed in the empty street as she slowly gathered her belongings, taking her time despite his repeated commands to exit the vehicle immediately. Miller could feel his heart pounding in his chest as the woman finally opened her car door, her movements deliberate and measured as if she were the one in control of the situation. Her heels clicked against the wet pavement as she stood to her full height, somehow managing to look down at him despite being several inches shorter. The entire scene was captured by his body cam, the footage that would later become mandatory viewing material for every police academy recruit in the state. Even as cold steel closed around her wrists, the elegant woman in an expensive charcoal suit maintained an unnervingly confident smirk. She simply shook her head when asked for identification at the precinct booking desk, whispering to herself, "These boys have no idea what's coming tomorrow." The fluorescent lights of the police station cast harsh shadows across her face as she was photographed for booking, her expression remaining unchanged as if she were posing for a magazine cover rather than a mugshot. The night shift officers gathered around the booking desk, their curiosity piqued by the well-dressed woman who carried herself with such authority despite her current situation. Officer Miller filled out the paperwork while stealing glances at his arrestee, who had taken to examining the station as if mentally redecorating it. The booking sergeant, Dave Thompson, a 20-year veteran, raised his eyebrows at the charges, wondering aloud if they were really necessary for a simple traffic stop. The woman requested her phone call with such commanding presence that Rookie Officer Jenny Chen almost handed over her personal cell phone before catching herself. The mysterious arrestee dialed a number from memory and spoke in hushed tones that somehow managed to sound both threatening and amused. Officer Miller tried to appear busy with paperwork while straining to hear the conversation, but could only catch fragments about tomorrow morning and preparing the necessary documentation. As she was being escorted to the holding cell, the woman paused to examine the station's outdated security cameras and ancient computer systems, making mental notes that would later appear in a scathing report about the precinct's need for technological upgrades. Her heels echoed through the corridor, creating a rhythm that seemed to mock the authority of those around her. Several officers shifted uncomfortably under her scrutinizing gaze. The holding cell was empty except for her, as if even the usual late-night residents of the drunk tank had decided to give her space. She settled onto the metal bench with the grace of someone sitting down to a fine dining experience, smoothing her designer suit and crossing her legs at the ankle as if she were waiting for a board meeting to begin rather than spending the night in custody. Officer Miller watched through the security feed as she pulled out a small notebook from a hidden pocket, the one item that had somehow escaped their search, and began writing what appeared to be an extensive list. The next morning, Albany County Courthouse buzzed with unusual energy as rumors spread about a high-profile arrest. Officer Miller adjusted his freshly pressed uniform, preparing to testify about his righteous arrest. Suddenly, the courtroom doors burst open, and every head turned in shock. The morning sun streamed through the towering windows of Courtroom 3, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors as clerks and attorneys whispered among themselves about the mysterious woman who had been arrested the night before. Miller stood at the prosecutor's desk reviewing his notes for what felt like the 100th time, his collar feeling increasingly tight as he noticed several senior officers and police officials filing into the courtroom, which was unusual for a simple traffic violation case. Deputy Chief Roberts himself had taken a seat in the back row, his face unreadable as he studied the proceedings. The gallery was packed with spectators, an unusual sight for an early morning hearing. Defense attorneys, who normally would be rushing between courtrooms, lingered by the doors, their curiosity evident in their hushed conversations. Judge Henderson, a man known for his punctuality and no-nonsense demeanor, seemed to be taking his time arriving, which added to the growing tension in the room. The court officers appeared unusually alert, their eyes constantly darting to the main entrance as if expecting something extraordinary to unfold. The air conditioning hummed quietly in the background, barely masking the sound of shuffling papers and whispered speculations about the case that had brought so many important figures to the courthouse. Officer Miller felt his confidence beginning to waver as he noticed several news reporters slipping into the back of the courtroom, their presence suggesting this was far more than a routine traffic stop case. His training sergeant had always warned him about cases that attracted media attention, saying they had a way of turning simple situations into career-defining moments. The young officer unconsciously touched his badge, a habit he had developed when nervous, remembering his father's words about how a badge was only as honorable as the person wearing it. The bailiff finally approached the bench, clearing his throat before making an announcement that caused the entire courtroom to fall into an expectant silence. The atmosphere grew heavy with anticipation as footsteps could be heard approaching from the judge's chambers. Miller gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white as the door began to open. What happened next would become one of the most talked about moments in Albany legal history. The color drained from Officer Miller's face as Sarah Martinez, the infamous state's chief prosecutor known for ending careers of corrupt officials, strode in wearing the same designer suit from last night. The young officer felt his career flash before his eyes as she approached the bench with a predatory smile. The entire courtroom erupted in hushed whispers as recognition dawned on the faces of every legal professional present. Martinez's reputation preceded her as the most formidable prosecutor in the state, having never lost a case in her 15-year career. Deputy Chief Roberts immediately stood at attention, his previous relaxed demeanor vanishing as he recognized the woman head approved for overnight detention. Miller noticed his superior officer frantically typing on his phone, likely alerting the police commissioner about the situation. The reporters in the back of the courtroom were furiously scribbling notes, their eyes gleaming with the prospect of a career-making story. Martinez's presence transformed the simple traffic violation hearing into what would undoubtedly be tomorrow's headline. Martinez moved through the courtroom like a force of nature, her Louboutin heels clicking against the marble floor in a rhythm that seemed to match Miller's racing heartbeat. She carried a thick folder under her arm, which Miller recognized from her car's passenger seat the night before. Only now, he could clearly see the state seal emblazoned on its cover. The same documents he had dismissed as unimportant during the arrest now seemed to hold the weight of his entire future. The temperature in the courtroom seemed to drop several degrees as Martinez passed the defense table, where Miller stood frozen, her perfectly tailored suit and commanding presence making his freshly pressed uniform feel like a cheap costume. Several senior attorneys who had been observing from the gallery quickly gathered their belongings and left the courtroom, not wanting to witness the impending destruction of a young officer's career. Judge Henderson himself appeared momentarily stunned before regaining his composure and straightening his robes. Officer Miller could feel the weight of every eye in the courtroom as Martinez methodically arranged her documents at the prosecutor's table, the same table he had been standing at moments before with such confidence. The irony of the situation was not lost on anyone present as the state's top prosecutor prepared to address a case where she herself was the alleged perpetrator. The morning sunlight streaming through the courthouse windows seemed to create a spotlight effect on the unfolding drama. Chief Prosecutor Martinez approached the bench with measured steps, nodding briefly to the judge who appeared to be suppressing a smile. She then turned to face Officer Miller, her expression completely neutral as she began methodically unpacking her briefcase, removing a series of documents stamped with various government seals and timestamps from the previous evening. The tension in courtroom 3A reached a fever pitch as she cleared her throat, preparing to address the stunned audience. The security footage from the precinct played silently on the courtroom screens, showing Martinez maintaining her composure throughout the entire booking process, her calm demeanor now taking on new meaning as the officers present shifted uncomfortably in their seats. She produced a series of emergency orders bearing the governor's signature, revealing that at the time of her arrest, she had been racing against time to prevent the execution of an innocent man at Albright State Prison. Martinez's voice carried throughout the silent courtroom as she detailed how she had been personally contacted by the governor after new DNA evidence had surfaced in a decade-old murder case. The defendant was scheduled for execution at midnight, and she had been rushing to file the stay of execution papers when Officer Miller had initiated the traffic stop. Her attempts to explain the urgency of her mission had fallen on deaf ears as the young officer focused solely on asserting his authority. The chief prosecutor walked the court through the timeline, presenting surveillance footage from various traffic cameras showing her Mercedes accelerating through the red lights, while simultaneously displaying her phone records, revealing 17 missed calls from the governor's office and the prison warden during her 3-hour detention. Officer Miller watched as his righteous arrest transformed into a near-catastrophic impediment to justice that could have cost an innocent man his life. Martinez pulled out her state-issued credentials, which had remained in her vehicle during the booking process, the gold badge catching the morning light. As she held it up for the court to see, she explained how she had chosen not to pull rank during her arrest, hoping that Officer Miller would follow proper procedure and check her vehicle's registration, which clearly indicated her position within the state government. The young officer felt his legs grow weak as he realized the multiple opportunities had missed to avoid this situation. The courthouse fell into stunned silence as she revealed the innocent man had nearly been executed during her 3-hour detention. Judge Henderson removed his glasses in disbelief, while Officer Miller gripped the podium to steady himself as the gravity of his mistake crashed down upon him. Martinez proceeded to share the harrowing details of how the death row inmate Marcus Thompson had come within 40 minutes of execution before her emergency filing finally reached the prison warden. The sound of the clock ticking on the courtroom wall seemed deafening as everyone present contemplated how close they'd come to an irreversible tragedy. Security footage from the prison played on the courthouse screens, showing the frantic moments as prison officials received the last-minute stay of execution, the timestamps clearly visible in the corner matching precisely with Martinez's release time from custody. Her phone records, displayed on another screen, showed the desperate calls from the governor's office, the prison warden's increasingly panicked voicemails, and the defense attorney's pleas for intervention, all going unanswered while she sat in a holding cell. Martinez's voice remained steady as she described how the new DNA evidence had conclusively proven Thompson's innocence in the decade-old murder case for which he had been convicted. The evidence had been discovered by a rookie lab technician working late that very evening, leading to the desperate race against time that Officer Miller had unwittingly interrupted. The chief prosecutor produced the lab reports bearing timestamps from the previous night, showing how the DNA matched another suspect who was already serving time for a similar crime. The gravity of the situation weighed heavily on every person present as Martinez explained how she had been personally handling the case due to its sensitivity and the potential fallout of executing an innocent man. She detailed how the original conviction had been secured by her predecessor, a man now serving time himself for evidence tampering in multiple cases. Officer Miller felt physically ill as he realized how his overzealous enforcement of traffic laws had nearly resulted in the death of an innocent man because he hadn't bothered to properly verify Martinez's identity or listen to her explanation. Instead of demanding the officer's badge, Martinez's voice softened as she shared her own rookie mistake story from 15 years ago. The entire courtroom leaned forward as she transformed the tense scene into a masterclass on humility, power, and the responsibility that came with wearing any badge. She recounted her first year as a junior prosecutor when she had almost sent an innocent teenager to prison because she refused to listen to his explanation about being at the wrong place at the wrong time. Her pursuit of a conviction had blinded her to obvious evidence of his innocence. The chief prosecutor walked around the courtroom as she spoke, her heels no longer clicking menacingly but moving with purpose. As she approached Officer Miller, who stood rigid with shame, She described how a senior judge had taken her aside after that case and taught her the most valuable lesson of her career, that true justice required not just following procedures but listening with an open mind to every person regardless of their appearance or circumstance. The parallels between her past mistake and Miller's current situation were not lost on anyone present. Martinez pulled out newspaper clippings from that 15-year-old case, showing how she had publicly apologized to the teenager and his family, then used her mistake as motivation to create the state's first wrongful conviction review unit, the same unit that had discovered the new evidence in Marcus Thompson's case. Officer Miller found himself nodding along as she explained how that near mistake had shaped her entire approach to prosecution, making her both more thorough and more compassionate. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted as Martinez shared how that teenage boy she had almost wrongfully convicted was now a respected defense attorney working alongside her in the very same courthouse. She pointed to a young man sitting in the gallery who stood briefly acknowledging his role in her story. Several officers in the courtroom removed their hats as the weight of responsibility that came with their badges seemed to grow heavier with each word she spoke. Judge Henderson watched with approval as Martinez skillfully transformed what could have been a career-ending humiliation for Officer Miller into a powerful teaching moment about the delicate balance between enforcing the law and serving justice. She emphasized how every person in law enforcement, from beat cops to chief prosecutors, needed to remain humble enough to admit their mistakes and learn from them. The morning sun, now streaming fully through the courthouse windows, seemed to highlight the tears forming in Officer Miller's eyes as he recognized the gift of wisdom being offered instead of punishment. Tears welled in Officer Miller's eyes as Martinez requested the charges be dismissed, suggesting instead that he join her task force on police reform. The young officer, who came expecting career execution, found himself being offered redemption by the very woman he had wronged. She explained how his bodycam footage from the previous night had captured something far more valuable than a traffic violation. It had documented a perfect case study in how preconceptions and rigid adherence to protocol without context could lead to potentially catastrophic consequences. Martinez pulled out an official document bearing the state seal and placed it on the judge's bench. It was a proposal for a new training program that would be mandatory for all law enforcement officers in the state, focusing on situational awareness and the importance of listening to civilians during encounters. She explained how Miller's interaction with her would serve as the cornerstone of this curriculum, demonstrating both what not to do and how to handle similar situations in the future. The chief prosecutor described her vision for the task force that would bridge the gap between law enforcement and the legal system. Officers like Miller would work directly with prosecutors to develop better protocols for handling emergency situations and identifying legitimate credentials even under pressure. She emphasized how his perspective as someone who had learned these lessons firsthand would be invaluable in shaping future police training. The gallery watched in amazement as Martinez outlined a comprehensive reform proposal that would use this incident as a catalyst for positive change rather than a cautionary tale of career destruction. She detailed how Miller would help develop new verification procedures for emergency situations involving state officials, while also serving as a liaison between the police department and the prosecutor's office. Officer Chen, the rookie who had almost handed over her phone during booking, was also invited to join, recognizing how fresh perspectives could contribute to meaningful reform. Judge Henderson nodded approvingly as Martinez explained how the task force would also address the technological upgrades needed at the precinct, ensuring that officers had immediate access to verified credential databases and emergency protocols. The same outdated systems that had failed to alert Miller to her status would be replaced with cutting-edge technology that could prevent similar mistakes in the future. Deputy Chief Roberts sat back in his chair, a look of relief washing over his face as he realized this incident might actually strengthen rather than damage his department's reputation. The case became required teaching at the police academy, with both Miller and Martinez leading the sessions together. 5 years later, when Officer Miller became the youngest captain in Albany history, He credited that rainy night for teaching him that true authority comes not from a badge, but from wisdom and compassion. The infamous traffic stop video played on screens throughout the state police training facilities, showing newer generations of officers how a potential disaster transformed into a catalyst for systematic change. Captain Miller now stood before fresh recruits, sharing his story with a sense of purpose that could only come from experiencing both failure and redemption. The reforms he and Martinez implemented had revolutionized how law enforcement handled emergency situations, creating a seamless verification system that could instantly confirm the identity and authority of state officials. The technological upgrades they pioneered had spread beyond Albany, becoming the gold standard for police departments across the country. Martinez and Miller had developed an unlikely friendship, their contrasting perspectives creating a powerful partnership that bridged the gap between law enforcement and the legal system. Together, they had prevented 3 wrongful convictions. Using the new protocols they established, Marcus Thompson, the man whose life had nearly been lost that night, now worked alongside them, speaking at conferences about the importance of thorough investigation and open-minded justice. The original holding cell, where Martinez had spent those crucial 3 hours, had been converted into a small museum of sorts, displaying the outdated equipment and procedures that had nearly led to tragedy. Rookie officers were required to spend an hour there reading the case files and reflecting on how split-second decisions could have life-changing consequences. The notebook Martinez had written in during her detention was framed on the wall, its pages filled with the reforms that would later transform the department. Captain Miller kept the handcuffs had used that night mounted in his office, not as a trophy but as a humble reminder of how authority without wisdom could lead to devastating consequences. Every morning he would touch them before starting his shift, remembering the lessons learned on that rainy night when he had almost become another cautionary tale. Instead, his story had become a beacon of hope, showing how mistakes, when handled with grace and wisdom, would lead to profound positive change.